Here's a bio on Glenn. Glenn Magelssen has a PhD in astrophysics from the University of Colorado. His scientific research has included solar physics, laser and ion beam fusion, neural nets, code development, and stockpile stewardship. He has authored and co-authored over 130 scientific papers. He has studied theology most of his life and has taken a 4-year course called EFM from the University of the South on Old and New Testament, Christian history, and Christian theology. He is a Stephen minister, a member of the Bethlehem Lutheran Church, and on the Self-Help Board. He has given faith and science talks on cosmology, genetics, evolution, and near-death experiences. He enjoys wine and wine collecting, music, art, and hiking. The outdoors is a place of comfort and peace for him. He has been influenced by many authors, including C.S. Lewis, Joseph Sittler, Richard Feynman, John Steinbeck, Clarence Jordan, and Paul Tournier. Okay, let's get started. I'll turn this over to Glenn. Oh, yeah, okay.
Good evening. Welcome. Tonight, as you already heard, I will give a talk on the history of vaccines, Christian response to vaccination. Some of you older people may remember getting the smallpox and or polio vaccine. Actually, I remember the smallpox because it hurt. It left a scar. I believe the development of vaccines is one of the greatest accomplishments of medicine over the last 200 years. By the end of my talk, I hope you understand why I've made such a statement. My talk will emphasize the history of smallpox, polio, and coronaviruses. Vaccines, I'm sorry. I will start by explaining how vaccines work, and then describe a number of different types of vaccines. This will be followed by a brief history of smallpox, its vaccine, and Edward Jenner's role in the vaccine development. This will be followed by the significant work of Louis Pasteur and Edward Koch. I will then switch to a discussion of polio, a brief history, and the Salk and Sabin vaccines. This will be followed by a short segment on other vaccines. I will end the discussion by exploring the current coronavirus vaccines. What I consider to be a Christian response to vaccination will complete my talk. I don't know about you, but I am really amazed at how the body works in fighting disease. It's almost miraculous. So the purpose of vaccines, of course, is to protect us. When a pathogen, a virus, bacterium, or other microorganism that can cause disease enters your body, your immune system generates antibodies and enlists other cells to try to fight it off. Depending on the strength of your immune response and how effectively the antibodies and cells fight off the pathogen, you may or may not get sick. When you get a vaccine, it introduces some aspect of the pathogen that isn't strong enough to make you sick, but it is enough for your immune system to generate antibodies against it. As a result, you gain future immunity against the disease without having gotten sick. Here are some types of vaccines. Something called the live attenuated. The live virus or bacteria's ability to produce disease in a human is attenuated to the point that it cannot cause illness, but elicits an immune response. There's the killed or inactivated vaccine. The virus or bacteria is killed or inactivated using heat or chemicals. This destroys the pathogen's ability to replicate, but keeps it intact so that the immune system can still recognize it. Toxoids. Some bacterial diseases are not directly caused by a bacterium, but by a toxin produced by the bacterium. Vaccines for this type of pathogen can be made by inactivating the toxin that causes the disease, using it as a vaccine, and getting an immune response. Subunit and conjugate vaccine. Subunit vaccines use only part of the target pathogen to promote a response from the immune system. And again, it's enough so that your immune system develops immunity to that particular bacterium or virus. Conjugate vaccines are made by using pieces of bacteria that are chemically linked to a carrier protein. This particular combination creates a strong immune system response without causing illness. Now, all of us have become very familiar with the RNA. I'm not going to talk about the DNA. I'll talk about the RNA vaccine. This vaccine uses RNA molecules to teach the immune system to target key viral proteins. RNA is engineered from germ genome, from the coronavirus. Instructions for the body to make the antigen. Antigen and pathogen, I will switch back and forth. You can use either term, is used. This creates an immune response and protects the body from the virus. Now that's really short. I'm going to give a very detailed explanation of this particular vaccine when I get to the coronavirus history. Smallpox. I don't know how many of you remember smallpox, but smallpox was a terrible disease. Smallpox killed over 300 million people in the 20th century. That's almost the population of our country. This is an example of a person that has smallpox. These lesions on the body are kind of a typical situation for a person who has smallpox. This is another example on a person's knee. They can see these lesions. I'll come back and talk about this. Kind of a brief history. There is evidence that the smallpox disease occurred as early as 500 AD, and that it may have been one of the diseases during the Black Death or the bubonic plague in 1346. And they think it also was one of the diseases that occurred following that particular situation, which occurred about every 100 years. It killed 30% of the people that got smallpox. In addition to that, if it didn't kill you, a lot of times people were maimed for life. Some people were blind. Some people had lesions on them that were there for the rest of their lives. It was a horrible disease. Variolation was kind of like a vaccine that was developed in the 1700s. The way this was done is, I'll go back to this picture. What they did is they took a needle and scraped a couple of these lesions. These lesions contain pus, and they got pus on the needle and then scraped the person's arm with that pus needle concentration. Another thing that they did is that they collected pus from a number of these lesions, and they made a powder, and they sprayed the powder in a person's nose. Well, It worked pretty well. However, 33% of the people that had this done to them died, just died. Edward Jenner noticed something. He wasn't the first person to notice this, by the way, but he was the first person to really think about it seriously. What he noticed is that milkmaids somehow developed an immunity to smallpox. Now, there was a disease in cows, and milkmaids milking cows a lot of the times actually got this disease. It was called cowpox. A lot of times on their hands, it was a mild disease. Typically, it didn't last more than a week. But he reasoned that maybe cowpox could be used as a vaccine. What's really interesting is that, we have this whole process now of testing of vaccine. Well, he started by testing on an 8-year-old boy. And then after he got the vaccine, he tested it by scraping some smallpox pus on his skin. And the boy remained healthy and didn't show any reaction. Then, what's really amazing to me, and this kind of gives you an idea how serious disease was, he actually inoculated his own son and himself as a test, and then some similar children. And he published the results in 1798 with very little fanfare, but he had a friend in London, Henry Klein. Klein made this information available to people in London, and it quickly took off. Without, in a fairly quick period of time, a lot of people in Europe were vaccinated with this Jenner vaccine. Now, this, I think, is also indicative of how important this was. This is a statement from President Thomas Jefferson in 1806, and this is made to Jenner's family to thank them. He said, "You have erased from the calendar of human afflictions one of its greatest. Yours is a comfortable reflection that mankind can never forget that you have lived. Future nations will know by history only that the loathsome smallpox has existed and by you has been eliminated. The last known case of wild smallpox occurred in Somalia in 1980. Disease has been declared eradicated." Louis Pasteur and Edward Koch, they are considered the founders of microbiology. Before their pioneering work, it was very confusing about how disease was transmitted. In fact, the going thought by most scientists at the time of his life was that it was carried in the air, and typically people thought that the smellier the air, the worse possibility of getting disease. They had no idea of how this was happening. And what Pasteur and Koch showed is that these kinds of illnesses were caused by a microbe. And that's why they're considered the founders of microbiology. And I think all of you have heard of pasteurization. Okay, you have milk that's pasteurized, all kinds of things that are pasteurized. He was the first person to show experiments that indicated that you could protect milk, for example, by pasteurization. But he did a lot of other things. He discovered that remember a weakened bacteria is one that's not dead, but it's weakened to the point that it doesn't hurt you. He developed a vaccine for cholera that was a weakened bacteria vaccine. He also developed a vaccine for anthrax. And this was a attenuated anthrax bacteria. And he used carbolic acid actually to destroy it. And that was very effective. I think he's probably, I don't really know why, I think certainly pasteurization is something that we all know, but he's also very famous for rabies vaccines. He developed a rabies vaccine. It requires a number of shots. On the negative side, he had a girl, a 10-year-old girl, only had one shot, and she died. But he was able to show that the vaccine worked well to the point that I'm going to tell you a story. This is a true story. In the United States, there were 4 boys that were bitten by a rabid dog. There was no vaccine in the United States at that particular time. And of course, Pasteur was in France. What they did is they took a boat from the United States to France to get the vaccine that Pasteur had created. Luckily for them, the rabies takes time to develop. They got the vaccine and they all survived and were well and went back to the United States. Edward Koch, he showed, well, there was a puzzle. The puzzle was that you could supposedly kill the anthrax bacteria and then it would come back. And what they found is that the bacteria created spores that could survive in conditions that killed the bacteria. And the spores could remain dormant for long periods, yet still cause anthrax when conditions changed. So when they developed an anthrax vaccine, it had to protect you from those spores. He is famous, Robert is famous for his pioneering work in growing cultures of bacteria. And I think all of us who had a biology class actually learned some of the techniques he developed. And he had a set of postulates that are still being used today by people in microbiology. What he said, the microbe is present in each case of the disease. That's the first thing. The microbe can be taken from the host and grown independently. Introducing a pure culture of the microbe into a healthy experimental host produces a disease in the host. The microbe can be isolated and identified from the host infected in step 3. Those are still being used. Now I'm going to move on. For older people, this probably looks terrible. This is called an iron lung machine. What happened is that polio would attack the lungs. And the other thing that scared people, much more, and I wish people were more scared now, but it attacked children. And it was a terrible disease. This particular machine was used to help people breathe, so to pump your lungs. Here's an example of what polio did to children. You can see that all of them were deformed in one way or another. My cousin got polio. The first major outbreak of polio in the United States occurred in Vermont in 1894. In 1916, an epidemic centered in Brooklyn killed more than 2,000 people. And there were 4,000 others that were killed across the country. However, thousands more were paralyzed. In fact, I think everyone here knows this, but I'll repeat it. 1921, polio paralyzed the future president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who at the time was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So this was a really scary disease for people because it attacked children. And clearly, if it can attack the President of the United States, you need to think about it. Think about what you're going to do. Now there's another story. Variants. You've heard a lot about variants. Well, this is a true variant situation. Initially, the polio vaccine was made for a particular virus. And initially it worked fine. But then they noticed that people who were vaccinated started to get the disease. And they were wondering what was going on. And what they found is that there was a variant. It was like the original, but it was different, and your vaccine didn't work for the variant. And so they had to vaccinate for that variant. Later, they found there was a third variant. And so the vaccines that finally were developed were for 3 variants. Most of you, well, some of you, I got the Salk vaccine. This actually was a vaccine that was developed by killing the virus, and it worked very well. In this case, it was tested on 1.8 million children. It was found to be 80 to 90% effective against paralytic polio. And that, of course, paved the way for its general use. Now, there's a story that I'm going to repeat because I think it's very important in terms of how vaccines are made. The Cutter Laboratories were charged with developing this vaccine for the public. And so they did, and they put it out. It killed 11 people, and hundreds were paralyzed. Basically, what they believe happened is that their production methods failed to kill the virus. And so this was a big lesson to be learned, how important it was to develop methods to make these vaccines safe. Albert Sabin. Probably many of you can remember this because it was kind of an unusual situation. This was an attenuated vaccine, and you got it with a sugar cube. So some of you may remember getting the vaccine with a sugar cube. And this was tested on 10 million children in the Soviet Union. And it was also very successful. The only vaccine in the country right now is the Salk vaccine. The reason for that is that the Sabin vaccine is an attenuated vaccine. So there's still some of the polio virus. It's weakened, but there's still some. And it was felt that it was best to use a vaccine where the virus was dead. In 1994, the Pan American Health Organization reported that 3 years had passed since the last case of polio in the Americas. Still, polio still exists in the world. Polio remains in 4 countries: Afghanistan, India, Nigeria, and Pakistan. Now here's a chart that has a lot of the different vaccines I've talked about. You have the RNA. This vaccine uses RNA molecules to teach the immune system to target key viral proteins. Its advantage, and the reason we got our vaccine out so quickly, that it's easy and quick to design. This was taken earlier, so they didn't have any data on how effective it was. Live attenuated, again, this is a weakened version of the actual virus that stimulates a robust immune response without causing serious illness. It may not be safe for those with compromised immune systems. This is used for measles and mumps. The inactivated vaccine uses the whole virus and it has been killed. Safe because the virus is already dead and it's easy to make. It's not as effective as a live virus. And I don't know exactly what the history of this is, but some previous inactivated vaccines have made the disease worse. I don't know the history of that. Polio is used as, there was the 2 vaccines, the inactivated and the live attenuated. And I talked about the subunit. This vaccine uses a piece of the virus surface to focus your immune system on a single target. Focus the immune response on the most important part of the virus for protection, and cannot cause infection. It may not stimulate a strong response, and other chemicals may be needed in order to boost long-term immunity. Pertussis is used in this particular case. It's for pertussis. The viral vector I haven't talked about. This is a really interesting approach. Now I'll talk a little bit more about this with the Johnson vaccine. This approach takes a harmless virus and uses it to deliver viral genes to build immunity. Live viruses tend to elicit stronger immune responses than dead viruses or subunit vaccines. Of course, it's important to pick a viral vector that is truly safe. An immune response to the viral vector could make the vaccine less effective. This has been used for Ebola. The coronavirus. I forgot to update this. I think it's already 4 million people. Over 600,000 Americans have died from the coronavirus. This is a kind of a picture that I'm sure that you've seen. Unfortunately, most of the pictures that you see of somebody who has the coronavirus are like this, like a person in the hospital, and people get the wrong impression about that. Again, you have this. I've been looking for a picture of the lungs. This really affects the lungs. I haven't found a really good one yet. If I do, I will put it in my paper. You might wonder how many different vaccines are being studied for this virus. Well, a lot. The live attenuated is being studied, the inactivated is being studied, the subunit is being studied, and of course we know the RNA is being studied and continues to be studied. The DNA is also being studied. So put on your thinking cap. This is a description of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, and this is a technical description. RNA vaccines work differently from your typical vaccine. They do not contain antigens. Instead, they contain a blueprint for the antigen in the form of genetic material, RNA. In the case of Pfizer's and Moderna's vaccines, the mRNA provides the genetic information to synthesize the spike protein that the coronavirus uses to attach to and infect human cells. Each type of vaccine is packaged in a proprietary lipid nanoparticles. Okay, lipid is a fat, and these nanoparticles are really tiny, 1 to 100 nanometers in size. And those are used to protect the RNA from rapid degradation. And this is why they have to remain cold. The nanoparticles also serve as a helper to attract immune cells to the site of injection. When injected into the muscle, the lipid nanoparticles containing the RNA inside are taken into the muscle cells, where the cytoplasmic ribosomes detect and decode the RNA, resulting in the production of the spike protein antigen. The antigen is exported to the muscle cell's surface, where the immune system's antigen presenting cells detect the protein, ingest it, and take it to regional lymph nodes, where the interactions with T cells and B cells results in antibodies, T cell mediated immunity, and the generation of immune memory T cells and B cells. You get the immunity that you need. Okay. So let's go back over this. One of the first things that confused me was it sounded like they actually created the coronavirus. Okay, is that what it sounds like? But they're not. What they do is they know what the coronavirus looks like, and they create a virus which is close to the coronavirus, but doesn't affect people. Okay, but it's close. It's close enough so that, not sure the right word is fake, but the body thinks that it's the coronavirus. Now it's interesting because remember going back to Jenner's thoughts? Turns out that cowpox and smallpox viruses are close. And that's why cowpox worked. So you actually create something that is close to the coronavirus, but something that doesn't hurt us. And that elicits the immunity. So that's part of it. The second part of it is, really for people who have some understanding of genetics. Talks about a ribosome. So I'm going to tell you kind of my simple explanation of it. Imagine that you have an instruction sheet. Okay, so you have this instruction sheet. You feed it into, say, a three-dimensional Xerox, a machine that creates three-dimensional objects. That instruction sheet reads it, and it creates the object. The ribosome does that. It reads the RNA, and it creates a protein. And that protein is what the body is using to protect you. Johnson & Johnson, adenovirus vaccine. This is different. The adenovirus vaccine uses a virus that has been altered so that it can't make you sick, it can't replicate, it cannot integrate into your DNA. So you take out some really important parts of the virus genome. That's what's done to the virus, is that actually a little genetic snippet is exchanged and placed into the enterovirus that is actually from the coronavirus. It's a section of genetic code that codes for the spike protein in the coronavirus. The enterovirus is like a Trojan horse, except that what's delivering is a good thing. Instead of delivering something that you don't want in your body, you get the vaccine. The enterovirus goes into your cell. It's got this Trojan horse code on it that make the spike protein. The spike protein then goes to the surface of your cell, and then your immune system recognizes it and starts to make antibodies. In the end, what you get is your body makes the spike protein. You develop an immune response to that spike protein, exactly like you do for the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. So I know this has been a lot, but I think it's important for people to really have a feeling about the history of vaccines and the developments that have occurred. So far, the Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson vaccines have been hugely successful in controlling the coronavirus, but there are unknowns. We don't know how long the vaccine will last. Again, this is a new vaccine. You heard from the CDC and Dr. Fauci and a lot of other people that they're worried about variants. Well, I gave you an example, the polio situation. You could end up with a variant where the vaccines don't work. That's why they're worried. Just a brief comment about this. You know, when initial vaccines were created, it was pretty incredible that they actually got things to work. Now you test on animals, and we had the first treatment of about 30,000 people. Half were given a placebo, half were given the vaccine itself. And basically they were testing to see how effective the vaccine was. And it turned out to be, for that particular large number of people, to be very effective, like 95%. Then still, actually, you could say that we're still in the emergency situation. And now about 160,000 Americans have been vaccinated, and the results have been hugely successful. There are some people that have gotten sick, but it's a very small percentage. And those people have had mild effects. And there's a lot about that going on right now. And very soon, this will go through the final stage. It'll have its final where it has full authorization, basically. So that's kind of the process that's being used now. Very careful. Well, personal comments on the Christian response to vaccination. I started studying religion and theology shortly after I graduated from high school, and I have continued most of my life. Like many of you, I have incorporated much of what I've learned into my life direction and my decision making. Here is an example. About 13 years ago, I was diagnosed as a diabetic. 10 years earlier, I had had a heart attack. By happenstance, I was reading the Bible and I was reminded that my body was a special gift from God and that He expected me to take care of it. I realized that I had ignored His calling. I weighed about 200 pounds and 5'9". According to the medical profession, I was obese. I realized I needed to greatly change my lifestyle. By better eating and exercising, I dropped my weight after about a year to 150 pounds. And I have maintained that weight for the last 13 years. When I have a decision to make, I ask for God's help and for help from the Christian community. Religion is a part of who I am. With this in mind, this is my response to vaccination. First of all, do your homework, okay? There are some people who could really be hurt by this vaccine. And the reason for that is that they have a very severe allergy to vaccines. Now, there's a gal on ABC, Shan Ashton, who in the past has had severe responses to vaccines. And it was really interesting to hear her talk. She said, well, I knew what the risks were. She's a doctor, by the way. And she's in communication with Dr. Fauci all the time. I knew what the risks were if I didn't have the vaccine. I knew what the risk was if I took the vaccine. So how do I handle it? She handled it by going to her physician and taking the vaccine in her physician's office with this material that you take. I forgot what I don't know, I can't remember what it's called, but if you have a severe reaction to something that you're allergic to, you take that and you'll be all right. So that's what she did, and she was all right. But as I'm saying, what are the risks, okay, for you? Do you have experience with vaccines that are very negative? Then if you do, go to the physician and really study that more. The second part of it is understand the risks. How many people are getting sick? What's the possibility of dying? Well, we've got more than 600,000 people that have died, so that is pretty scary. In addition to that, something like 20 to 30% of the people are having long-term effects. So you have that risk of not taking the vaccine. And then you have to go to, okay, this goes to, okay, how do I affect other people? How contagious is this virus? Can I make other people sick? Well, this is a virus that you can affect other people just by blowing on them, or it can come from your nose. And so, yeah, you can make other people sick. In fact, people that aren't vaccinated right now, there's a huge number of people that are getting sick. So that's the risk there. How important is a quick response? I talked about variants. The longer this virus exists, the greater the possibility of variants. And so once you make a decision, then you should get vaccinated or you don't get vaccinated. But I would suggest that if you don't have really good reasons for not getting vaccinated, you should get vaccinated as soon as you can. And how do you protect other people? Well, all of you are familiar with this. You know, you wear a mask because that prevents your breath, your nose material from getting to other people. So it protects you and it protects them. Social distancing. I don't know if very many of you have actually done this, but you can actually calculate how far vapor goes from your mouth. And of course, because it's going in 3D, it will dissipate pretty fast. But as you would guess, outdoors are a lot better than indoors. So those are the different things that need to be considered about taking this vaccine. Are we over the pandemic? I had hoped so, but we're not. Frankly, I'm becoming more worried just because of how long this virus is allowed to propagate. And of course, it has affected our lives for 1.5 years. And it looks like it's going to come back and affect us. I have a number of references here, and I have additional information for people. So with that, I will end. Thank you.
Yeah, very nice. Thanks, Glenn, for a great talk. We'll have some questions in the chat. And to our participants, feel free to continue to add questions to the chat. And you can now unmute yourself, and you can now reappear on video if you want. And Susan's going to be looking at the chat questions, and she'll convey those questions to our speaker, Glenn, and moderate the discussion. Okay, Susan.
So thank you. So Glenn, we have a comment from Maury.
Yeah.
Says, so polio attacked more than the chest muscles? Question mark.
Yeah, it attacked the lungs, it attacked your legs, it attacked, a lot of people became, lost their ability to walk, for example. For young people, I'm not sure this is true, but certainly the lungs was probably an element that was the scariest, because you can imagine that it's pretty hard to protect the lungs if you can't get them to pump air. And that was a serious problem. So it attacked a lot of different areas.
We have a second question. How was the polio virus spread?
Oh, that's a good question.
Glenn, this is Dan. The reason I asked that question is because I remember when I was a kid, that you had to be real careful. It was like at the end of the summer, like August was like the worst time, And it's not spread by mosquitoes or anything like that. So I don't actually remember how it was spread.
It wasn't spread by mosquitoes or anything like that. No. I'm not sure. My guess is that it was spread by your mouth, but I'll look that up. I don't know for sure. That's a good question.
The one thing I remember about the polio vaccine, those shots hurt like heck when I was just a little kid, and man, did they hurt.
They closed down a lot of swimming pools during polio in the
really?
50s. So I think there was worry that it was transmitted through waterborne illness sort of stuff.
Oh.
This is Gary, Glenn. While you were discussing it, I did a quick web search and I have an answer to that question. Uh, the virus lives in the throat and intestines of humans. It only affects people. It enters the body through the mouth and spreads through contact with feces of an infected person. Droplets from a sneeze or a cough
Ah,
are
Okay.
less common, but so you could imagine that that some transmission in swimming pool where you have some secondary
right,
contact with feces might be more of an issue.
right. Okay, that's good to know. So it's a combination of things. Thank you.
And we have a comment from Chick Keller. What exactly is a spike protein antigen?
That is the most important part of the coronavirus that attacks people. And so typically what you're trying to do is, if you're creating something that looks like that, you want to have something like that spike protein, is my understanding.
Okay. We have a comment from Maury.
Yeah.
So his comment is, what about the morality of not getting the COVID vaccine?
I think that if you go through all the different processes that I went through, I would have the tendency, being a Christian, that if there wasn't a good reason for not taking the vaccine, that a person should take the vaccine. By good reason, I mean if there wasn't a medical reason, for example, because the problem, actually, it's an area that's actually very interesting, because it has to do with, and our country is very much, how would I put it? I think confused in a way about individual rights versus community rights.
I could interject here if you want some theology. Thomas Aquinas famously said, people have inalienable rights, but in a community, they must give up some of those rights for the good of the community.
Right. That's exactly what I was going to say. And you have many situations where you're doing that, of course. You have driver's licenses, you have insurance, you can name all kinds of things that you have to have that are basically for the community. So that's kind of the way I would think about it. It would be interesting to actually have a discussion of that with some people who aren't willing to take the vaccine. Seems to me that a lot of them don't have good information about the vaccines. At least that's my impression. Go ahead, go on.
I think a lot of people are frightened as well, but let me go on to Vicky's question and comment. What is the morality of testing vaccines on children and the disabled? Sounds like a means to an end thinking, which is always morally dubious at best.
Well, actually, initially, of course, I didn't say this, but the vaccines were tested on children in special homes. Okay. It's a difficult question to answer, of course. The question is, okay, if you don't test it on children, how do you know that the vaccine is going to be effective and not harm them? So you have that on one side. And of course, that's true with human beings also. I mean, male human beings. And so even before you talk about children, you could actually bring up an ethical question about testing vaccines on animals. Is that fair? And again, you run up against the problem of developing the vaccine so that it can actually save lives versus not developing the vaccine. And so I would go with a process of actually developing the vaccine to save lives. Because I think the risk is much higher if you don't have the vaccine. I think that part of the issue is that there's been misinformation about vaccines, but also people kind of say, oh, this isn't going to hurt me. I'm sorry. If they saw a picture of somebody with smallpox, they would have never made such a statement. And so there's partly that kind of issue going on also. So hard question to answer. There's an ethical issue associated with it. There are ethical issues from the very beginning of the development of vaccines, as I've mentioned in part of this talk. On the other hand, the vaccines have been incredible for saving lives.
This
Okay.
is Vicky, and a great presentation, but I noticed that the development of the COVID vaccine was the opposite. Started on adults, and it started only with volunteers and in a wide spectrum demographics rather than targeting specific race or age or economic. The way that they rolled out the testing for COVID vaccines has been unlike any other vaccine protocols for testing, to the point where children are last for this one.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think that was to overcome the history of dubious moral behavior of public health officials of using various segments of the population as guinea pigs without informed consent. And when presented with this new threat, none of us could give informed consent because none of us knew what it was.
I think there certainly is part of that. Yeah,
I found it interesting that they started with adult volunteers,
right.
as many as they could get.
Yeah. And they tried to do it across the spectrum. I think, unfortunately, the Black and brown people in our country were affected more than the white people. And of course, you can think of many, many reasons for that. But it certainly went that direction. The other thing that's a little bit puzzling to me is that this Delta virus is definitely a bit different than the Alpha virus. That's one of the reasons why I'm a little worried. And it appears to attack younger people. Now, the problem with that, I don't know for sure because a lot of the younger population is not getting vaccinated. So I don't know if it's related to that. On the other hand, it seems like there are more children that are getting this disease. And that's a little bit different. And also, the latest information, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but people that have been vaccinated and get the Delta virus, that is, they've been vaccinated, but they actually get sick, they're finding that they can pass the virus. With the Alpha virus, that didn't happen. So there's another aspect to this particular virus that is different. And that's why they're asking vaccinated people to wear masks.
Glenn, so I think that may have answered Gary Stradling's comment or question, which is, can you discuss the potential for the Delta variant affecting vaccinated people with the RNA vaccines?
Well, it would if I understood what Glenn just said, but I missed a word or something, and it didn't come through. I didn't understand. So
Okay,
repeat your answer, please.
the latest data, Gary, that just came out just within this week, is that there have been breakthrough cases, that is people that have had the Pfizer vaccine, for example, or the Moderna vaccine, who have gotten sick. Okay,
Breakthrough
Well,
defined
with-
as a vaccinated person getting sick?
yes, and with the Delta variant. And I don't know if you remember, but with the Alpha variant, when a person got sick, he did not pass that virus on to anyone else. It appears that that's not the case with the Delta variant, that a person who gets sick doesn't have to be really sick, but a person who is sick can pass that virus on to another person. And so what they're suggesting is that people that have been vaccinated wear a mask if you're in an area where there's a lot of disease. Just makes sense. So that's what they're learning.
So let's just, can we talk about that last statement for a minute? The wearing of masks prevents the mask wearer from projecting aerosol particles out into the room.
Right.
How does it help for a vaccinated person to wear a mask if other people are expelling those particles into the room and the mask is not, unless the mask is filtering them out?
Well, you only get a partial effect, of course, when you're doing that. But the reason you're wearing a mask, if you're infected, okay, is that you prevent the person from getting infected when you're wearing the mask. So that would be the reason. You're not, it's really, you're protecting another person. You're not protecting yourself as well, as you just said.
Okay, so you're saying on the chance that the vaccinated person is infected, to prevent them from spreading that undetected infection to other people. Okay,
That's right.
I got the logic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next couple of questions go back to polio, so I'll just read them. One from Marie. Polio attacks the nervous system, so muscle lost innervation. Is that, hopefully I said that right. And then the other one from Marie is that polio is spread through fecal oral swimming pools were a common source. So those are two comments. I think yeah. Okay, so Chick asks, what is the morality of refusing to allow unvaccinated people to go places and do things? This is when we need a breakout room.
Oh, that's a good question. I think that it goes back, if you're a Christian, it goes back into considering other people as well as yourself. So it depends on what morality you're talking about. As a Christian, I would have problems with that because unless the person has, as I said, has particular problems with the vaccine, autoimmune problems or something like that. So the morality really goes back to where the morality is coming from. And unfortunately, we're in a situation, I'll describe it like this. You have some people who don't care about anyone except themselves. And you have some people who care about somebody else, typically their family. And that's it. Then you have some people that care about themselves, their family, and their community. And so you have kind of a difficult situation. So how do you change a person's attitude about how to behave in response to community? We haven't done very well over the many years. I think, as I said, part of it, I hate to say this, is almost scare tactics. For those of you who saw my abstract, I had a baby that had smallpox. It is, looking at that baby, for me anyway, it was terrible. And so do you force people into doing something? I don't know. I think that they're actually thinking about doing that.
So Glenn, I have a slight comment on that.
Yeah.
It's only coming from my training as an attorney.
Okay.
And that's that in the comment that Chick says, it says about unvaccinated people to go places and do things. Okay, if a venue is aware that unvaccinated people could be carriers, it creates a liability. And so there, you may not see much of it now, but people love to sue. So at some point in time, people are going to say, you should have known, you should have put into effect certain precautions to disallow unvaccinated people from infecting the rest of the group.
Right.
So that in our community setting, we've begun to rely on litigation and laws to make the community do what the community wants it to do. So I just throw that in there, as it's scary to me to think in the not too very distant future, the litigation that's going to come out of this situation. So just a comment.
Yeah, and in fact, what's happening is that there are a lot of industries that are going to require that you're vaccinated or that you're tested at least 2 or 3 times a week.
Exactly.
And that's going to happen. I don't see that that's not going to happen because they want to, you're right, they want to protect the rest of the people. And
they don't want to protect them, Glenn. Don't go down that path. They don't want to get sued by someone that gets infected and they didn't have the precautionary disciplines in place. So I would like to say that they care. Believe me, they only care about the bottom line. So that's that training that I'm saying they are going to require it if you want the job, if you want to come into work, if you want to do this. Because of the liability that they are facing.
Well, I think that Biden's also thinking, I don't know how it's going to go, thinking about requiring all people in government to be vaccinated or to be tested at least twice a week.
May I comment on this point? I had posted something on the chat, but it turns out I posted it to an individual. I didn't post it to the group, so you didn't see it. But my observation was that with this plague, Americans are getting an opportunity to reevaluate delegated power to government, as there is debate about the effectiveness of isolation masks vaccines, particularly when the government is not uniform in its views and where its direction changes. The issue is that the freedoms of Americans are intrinsic and the government's powers are delegated, but some people are quite unhappy about how those delegated powers have been wielded. I know a number of people who think that New Mexico was a little draconian and particularly served big business instead, where could have been more uniform. These kind of issues are in debate. I note that after the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, that it took a decade or more to figure out what the pathogen really was, what the nature of transmission was, et cetera. And we're still debating whether masks are effective. So our technical views are in flux even today. But really the issue, one of the issues for us is governance. How much freedom do we want to have ourselves with regard to whether somebody comes into our business who's not been vaccinated? Should an American business owner be able to decide what he or she wants in terms of clientele and exposure to them?
Absolutely.
Or should a parent be able to say, I do not want my child to go into a classroom with unvaccinated people? Is that an option that we should have? Those are freedom issues and essentially American issues.
Well, let's take the example of the stop sign. Should you have the right to go through the stop sign?
Well, Richard, we agree as a community on that law. So we elect representatives, the representatives pass the law, and we keep the law in place over many generations of elections. So
But we don't have that option with a disease that's a pandemic. It's an immediate, we have to have an immediate response. We don't have the luxury of litigating and passing legislation that takes years to resolve. We have to move fast.
Yeah, that's the
So
conundrum.
it's a different situation.
It's the conundrum. It's not a mandate. There's nothing in the Constitution that says everything that we say here is wiped away if you've got a short-term crisis.
Yeah.
Could we stop sharing so we can see everybody?
So Glenn, if you'll hit the stop share. So I think we've gone through whoops, where'd it go?
I did stop sharing.
Okay. Just a moment. Oh, thank you. There we go. I think we've gone through most of the questions in the chat. Richard, did you have any other thing you wanted to add about the children?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Glenn for a really great presentation. For those of you that don't know me, I'm actually a molecular biologist and I work on the virus actually. So I come at with the perspective of the science and where the science is going. One of the things we learned early on in the scientific literature is the reason that kids weren't getting sick, nearly as sick as adults, is that kids have a very active, what's called innate immune system. That's a different immune system than what Glenn described, which is the adaptive immune system that produces antibodies. So the innate immune system response leads to the production of proteins that interfere with the virus, such as interferon that you've heard about, but also for bacteria, antibacterial peptides and so on. So it's a very different kind of immune system. It's actually evolutionarily very primitive. It's the dominant and the only immune system in invertebrate animals and in plants. But vertebrate animals develop the adaptive immune response. So early on, when they were trying to understand why children were doing so well against the virus, what they found out is they have a very strong innate immune response that actually is quite effective in controlling the virus. They then looked at adults, and what they found was that in adults that had very difficult disease states and ultimately died, part of the reason that they died was their innate immune system was actually late in recognizing the virus and was slow to respond. And so part of the, coming back to the issue, why aren't we testing children? I think it's really two issues. One we know is that children have a relatively high level of protection for this virus. And that's why you don't see as many deaths, of course, with children. But the other issue, of course, is ethical. And that is, I think we all appreciate that you start with adults, maybe old adults first that have had a lifetime. And then you work down the chain eventually to children. And of course, it's getting there. We're now vaccinating 12-year-olds. But you have to do this slowly and carefully. And there are protocols that the NIH has developed for how to do this. So hopefully that's helpful in this discussion.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Richard.
I just heard you say that the old adults' lives were less valuable.
Well, I'd put more value in my grandchildren than I would in myself. I'll leave it at that. It's a personal decision. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Glenn, I toss it back to you. There are really no more comments in the chat. If I've missed one, please somebody speak up. Are there any other comments or questions for Glenn?
Yeah, this is Maury. Apparently there are people who are asymptomatic but have the virus, and if they are not wearing a mask, they can spread it to others. Is that true, or?
That's true. Yes. And so that's a problem. That was one of the problems very early on.
Right.
So if you have, if you're a carrier of the virus and you receive the vaccination, is there a different response that your body will have to the vaccine?
Boy. Richard.
Yeah, Glenn, I can actually comment on that. And the answer is
Yeah,
yes.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
The answer is actually yes. It's been shown empirically that people that have had the disease can still get it without the vaccine. They're somewhat still susceptible. And the reason is that the range of antibodies that are called neutralizing antibodies that actually knock out the virus that are produced when you're sick is not as powerful in a sense as the vaccines are. And there's actually a good molecular reason for this. The vaccines that we're taking are all against the spike protein. And the spike protein is sort of like a switchblade. And when it binds to the cells at what's called the ACE2 receptor, which is what it targets in your cells, and those are very abundant in your lungs, by the way. That's why it's such a big problem in your lungs. But when it binds to that ACE2 receptor, that switchblade, which is the spike protein, is clipped by an enzyme associated with the ACE2 receptor that cleaves the spike protein, not entirely into two pieces, but cleaves part of it. And then what happens is the switchblade springs open and the spike protein gets longer and it exposes a patch on the spike protein that allows it to enter into your cells. So we knew that was the mechanism. That was actually known from MERS, and it goes way back, which is a relative virus, of course. And so when they designed the vaccine, they actually targeted the spike protein when it was in the folded form of the switchblade before it was processed. And when you target the antibodies against that spike protein in that stage, it can't bind to the receptor and be processed. And that prevents it from actually infecting your cells. And the way they made this work is they actually introduced some mutations into the spike protein that would prevent it from being clipped and extending into that form that can infect cells. And all of the Moderna and the Pfizer use that strategy. They modified the spike protein so it cannot be processed and converted into an infectious form. And then the antibodies are directed against that folded spike protein, and they neutralize it and they prevent it from actually getting into your cells. Now, your body can't do that. It can't make an antibody against a modified protein that it's never seen before. So for that reason, the vaccines are actually additionally effective. And so it's recommended that if you've been sick, that you actually get the vaccine still, that it will add an extra layer of protection. And there's actually now good data that shows that works.
Wow, okay.
Would that explain why some people get sick, mildly sick or more after they've had the vaccine?
Yeah, so that's a complicated issue. So after you've had, as Glenn pointed out, you have these memory cells. So they know how to make an antibody against the spike protein. But it takes a while for them to actually kick in and produce a lot of antibodies. There's time involved here, several days actually. And it's during that period when the virus can still replicate when the antibody titers are low, but eventually they become high enough to prevent the infection from becoming a health issue. In other words, you don't get very sick. But during that initial phase, you're still infectious because you are still allowing some virus to replicate, and it can still be spread.
Thank you.
Yep. And there's no way around that, by the way. That's just the way the immune system works. Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Patrick?
Yeah, so I'm a physician. I'm a surgeon, actually. My service gets consulted when children have COVID to the point that their lungs are failing and they have to get put on bypass. So I see these COVID patients, and I guess just a couple of observations. I think the first, just going off of what we were just talking about, I don't know that I mean, maybe there is, and I just haven't heard it, but I don't know that there's great evidence that the people who are getting the COVID vaccine that are simultaneously infected get a worse form of the virus. And yes, I agree with what Richard said. It's going to take about a week for your immune system to kick off a fairly robust response to any vaccine that you're given. And then really 3 weeks before you start getting IgG antibodies, which are great memory antibodies that stick around for a long time. So I guess that's just one thing that I'd add. And then the other thing is that, yeah, children, like Richard said also, they're not getting COVID nearly as much. And the kids that are, in general, have pretty significant comorbidities. For example, there was a child that we had on bypass for about 2 months, and then he eventually passed away. But he had advanced cancer and then had a bone marrow transplant, and so was quite immunocompromised. So it's usually those sorts of situations. There are some exceptions, but it's not like the adults where, I mean, for example, the adult academic hospital that I'm affiliated with, they have like 60 adult patients in their ICU, right? Well, I don't know if they're just in the ICU, but I mean, the hospital is overflowing with patients at this point.
So I have a question now. It's a question about polio and smallpox. Clearly, polio attacked children. What was different, or do you know what was different about that virus so that it attacked children so much?
Gosh, I'm sorry, I just don't know the answer to that.
And of course, the other thing is the smallpox attacked everyone, children, all ages. And so there's something, I mean, the possibility that children can get really sick depends, it sounds like, depends very much on what the virus or what the bacteria is. And I don't have the answer to that either, but it certainly came to mind because I've read enough now to know that one of the reasons why polio scared people so much is that it attacked their children.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the mechanisms are different for each virus, and bacteria also have, depending on their strain, different mechanisms for evading the immune response, and certainly have different efficacies based on age. For instance, varicella, which caused chickenpox, often would affect young people, and then it would remain latent until old age, and then people would have severe pain once it recurred. And there's a lot of variables that I think go into these things, and I don't think I could get into the details at the moment, and I probably have to review as well in order to give a really educated response.
Glenn,
Thank you,
I thought I might share a comment. One of the things that's been really encouraging in the scientific community is the sharing of information that's really unprecedented on a global basis. The recognition that this was a big problem came very quickly, and the scientific community, in a very unusual way, because usually scientists are competing against each other, they decided to share information. And so every paper that's published on COVID or SARS-CoV-2 is open access and available to everybody for free. And that's really moved the science fast. So the scientific community really picked up the problem very quickly and responded appropriately.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I agree completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had heard that. I think, Richard, you and I talked about that, and I thought that was incredible.
Yeah, it's never been seen before.
Anyway, I'm getting tired.
So at this point, let me pass it back to Dan, unless there's any other final questions or comments. Dan, it's all
Okay.
you.
All right, Glenn, again, thank you so much for sharing your
Wait a
thoughts.
minute, Dan.
What?
I have a question.
Oh, okay, sure, please.
It was posted in chat to everyone,
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry.
which is,
Yes, I see.
do we know at what level of protection is provided by masks? Clearly, protection is provided, protect against droplets.
And
At
aerosols.
what point mask does not provide protection? Do we know that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I might. Go ahead, Glenn. I can
I
comment too. Yeah.
from listening to Dr. Fauci, listening to all the people from the CDC and their studies on the effectiveness of the mask, I would say that the data is available that it does help. Now, does that mean that I have a number? No. Richard, you may, but over and over again, it was clear that the mask actually reduced the number of people that got infected. And initially, they didn't see that. And it wasn't until, golly, I don't know, a couple months into the pandemic that they realized that in fact it did have an effectiveness to it. And so that's what I have seen and read, but I'm not an expert in this area. Richard, what do you know?
Yeah, it's actually been really well studied, how the efficacy of masks, and it includes aerosol science as well. There have been a lot of studies now published in the COVID literature on how far these particles can go and how long they persist in the atmosphere. And so some of the guidelines on spacing are actually based on really good aerosol science. Now, coming to the issue of masks, the N95 mask, which of course physicians and healthcare workers are using, actually has a pore size that will exclude the virus. And so the only issue then is, are there gaps where air is coming in around the N95 mask? So the really good ones, which seal well on your face, actually will not allow the virus into your air passageway. But you still have to wash hands and avoid touching your face and other parts of your body. But the cloth masks are good for the droplets, which, as you discussed earlier, Glenn, and it's really, I would say, if you do the combination of both, and so if I'm going to be flying next week and I'm going to wear both, the cloth mask as a cover over the N95 mask, mostly to hold the N95 mask very close to my face, then you can, I think, safely say the virus can't get in.
Okay.
So Richard, so I've been traveling a lot lately. So I see a lot of people wear double masks, but they also, and in my case as well, wear some form of glasses.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes. So yes, you can pick up the virus through various epithelial tissues, and that includes your eyes. So that's, although I would say most of the evidence is it's coming in through your lungs, and that goes back again to the fact that your lungs are full of these receptors that the virus targets. They're very abundant in lung tissue, and in other tissues they're not as abundant. So it's a probability issue. If you have a sufficient virus and you have lots of receptors, you'll still get it. But if you have insufficient virus and a low number of receptors in that particular tissue, you're less likely to get it. It's a probability function, and you just got to play the numbers. Yeah.
So if you wear a bandana,
Oh,
clearly it's going to stop the droplets.
yeah.
But is that really effective other than the droplet if you wear just a bandana?
Well, I would say that with the new Delta variant, which is highly infectious, that to be really safe, I would go with the N95.
You mean the KN95, right? Because
Yeah.
N95 is for the health workers.
Yes, both of them have a pore size that excludes the virus. It's less than 0.2 microns in diameter, and that will keep the virus from getting in.
So if you're really serious about wearing masks, shouldn't everyone be wearing a KN95 mask?
Yeah, yeah. But that's more for protecting you.
Otherwise,
Yeah, yeah.
how useful is it to wear a bandana or even two bandana?
Well, it'll keep the droplets out.
Oh, yeah, the droplets.
But of course, the smaller the droplet, the less effective the bandana is. And that comes back to aerosols. And, I actually saw a paper that said that in a grocery store where you have aisles, that the virus can be in an infectious state in that atmosphere for up to 6 hours.
Wow.
If somebody sneezes in one of the aisles, it plumes over the top and goes to the next aisle. And it depends on the air circulation in the environment as well. So every place is a different situation, depending on a lot of variables.
So will KN95 prevent that?
Yes.
In the situation that you talk about?
It's the best protection that's available, yes.
So everyone should have KN95.
Well, if you're really careful, I would go that route, yes. So on the airplane, I would say that that's really a good idea.
Richard, could I ask if there's any understanding of why the Delta variant is so much more infectious?
Yeah, it's actually a couple of, so the Delta variant is a complicated variant because it has over 20 mutations. And those mutations that give rise to the increased virulence are in a variety of different genes. Some of them are in the spike protein, and it's felt that those are probably the ones that contribute most. But there are other genes in the virus that are known to enhance infectivity as well. And those have mutations. So that's very hard to pull apart to understand exactly which gene in the virus is causing the most problem. But the good news is that the mutations in the spike protein do not appear to impact the efficacy of the vaccines. And we're hearing that over and over now, that we're still getting good protection. Now, the one doomsday scenario here, and this was, I heard this in a conference about a month ago that actually Dr. Fauci was the leadoff speaker. The one scary thing out there, and this is why we have to stop this now, as Glenn was making that point, is this virus has a very, very high rate of genetic recombination. And what that means is that if you're infected with two coronaviruses, say MERS and SARS, the likelihood of those viruses exchanging genetic information and generating a new strain is exceptionally high. And that could lead to new variants that are even more lethal than the current ones. And the great fear is that MERS and SARS will recombine. MERS has a much higher fatality rate, but it's a very poor infectious virus. If you get the Delta variant to recombine with MERS to form now a highly infectious and lethal virus, oh, it's a whole different world. It'll be very scary. And that's one of the great fears in the viral community that's working on this, is that could happen. And it's probably the way that SARS actually developed, was through recombination between related viruses that were found in the same organism, and it generated a whole new virus. So SARS-CoV-2, for example, has genes that are not found in MERS. They had to come from somewhere else. And I'm not going to get into the Chinese thing. But,
So,
yeah.
Richard, if it continues to mutate, do you think it can jump from humans to animals, like
Yeah.
dogs, people's dogs and cats?
Oh, for sure. And
Wonderful.
yeah. And it's been, of course, it's found in bats, it's found in pangolins, it's found in a variety of other animals. And part of the reason that China is the source of so many bad viruses, including flu viruses, is people live very close to their animals. And they go back and forth. Yeah.
Well.
On that note, we're going to pass it to Dan.
Oh, well, on that note, I thank you all for joining us this summer, and we hope you have a safe and healthy rest of the year. And oh, yes, let's thank our speaker again. It was such a great talk. And for Richard and the other people who've contributed here to the discussion in a major way. Thank you all. And we'll see you next summer. We'll be back online. Hopefully, we'll be back in person next year.
I hope so.
Things are going to go. We hope we're all back here next year. You're right. Good. Good night, everybody. Good. And
Thank
thanks,
you,
Glenn.
Richard.
Great.
Thank you, Glenn.
Good.
Take care, everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn.
Good. All righty. Great.
So Dan, if you'll stay on for just a moment.
Sure. Okay.
So I'm going to stop the recording for just a moment.